All right, today we're jumping right into the story of the USA. It's an incredible journey, really, packed with revolution, conflict, and just constant innovation. So here's the big question we're trying to answer. How on earth did a small collection of colonies, just kind of hanging on to the edge of a massive continent, turn into one of the most powerful countries in the world? That question is going to guide us through this whole story. Now, to really get this story right, we can't start with ships and flags. We have to start with the people who were here first, the ones who called this land home for thousands of years. The real starting point is that incredible and often violent collision of worlds when Europeans first arrived. Okay, look at this timeline. The first thing that should jump out at you is just the immense scale of time. We're talking about Native American tribes being here for at least 15,000 years. 15,000. So when you see the Vikings show up around 1000 AD or Columbus in 1492, that's like a blink of an eye in comparison. And it was Columbus's arrival that really kicked off a frenzy, a race to colonize, which led to England setting up its first permanent settlement in Jamestown in 1607. So fast forward to the 1700s, and you've got these 13 English colonies all along the East Coast. But here's the thing. They were totally different from each other. Up in New England, you had small farms and a lot of fishing. The middle colonies, places like New York and Pennsylvania, they were the breadbasket of the continent, super diverse. And then you go down south, and it's a completely different world. The entire economy was built on huge plantations growing crops like cotton and tobacco, and all of it, tragically, was built on the backs of enslaved people. So you have these three very different regions. But weirdly enough, they started to see themselves as having something in common, a kind of shared identity. And that new identity? It was about to put them on a direct collision course with the biggest empire on the planet, Great Britain. And really, the whole beef came down to this one simple, powerful idea. Think about it. The colonists were paying taxes to the British government, but they had zero say, no voice, no one representing them in the parliament that was making all the rules. It was a super simple concept, but it was enough to light the fuse for a revolution. By 1775, things just boiled over. Protests turned into battles, and boom, you've got a full-blown war. This was the American Revolution. You had leaders like George Washington taking charge of the army, and at the same time, you had brilliant minds like Thomas Jefferson starting to write down exactly what they were fighting for. And that's where the Declaration of Independence comes in. You know, we celebrate it on July 4th, but it was so much more than just a "we're breaking up with you" letter to Britain. For its time, it was a radical document. It said that all people have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was this incredible promise, this vision for a new kind of country, all while they were still fighting a brutal war just to exist, a war that wouldn't end until 1783. Okay, so they won the war. Now what? Well, they needed a set of rules, a rule book for the country, and that's the Constitution. It laid out the whole plan for the government, and in 1789, they elected George Washington as the very first president. But, and this is a huge but, those amazing ideals of life and liberty didn't apply to everyone, not even close. If you were an enslaved person, a woman, or a Native American, you were left out of this new idea of freedom. All right. A new century begins, the 19th century, and this new country starts to expand like crazy. It's growing at this incredible speed. But there's a problem. As it pushes west, the cracks, the deep divisions inside the country start getting wider and wider. So what was driving all this expansion? It was this idea called manifest destiny. It was basically the belief that the United States was supposed to stretch all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that it was their destiny. And the whole thing got a massive boost in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. With just one deal, the country literally doubled in size overnight, kicking off this huge rush westward. But here's where those cracks really start to show. As the country gets bigger, it's pretty clear it's becoming two completely different places. You've got the North, which is all about factories, cities, and immigrant labor. Then you have the South, which is still all about farming and is totally 100% dependent on the horrific system of slavery. And we're not just talking about different economies here. This was a fundamental disagreement about what kind of country they were going to be. Now, people didn't just accept this. A really powerful movement, the abolitionist movement, grew to fight against slavery. You had absolute heroes like Harriet Tubman, who risked her life over and over on the Underground Railroad, leading people to freedom. And you had incredible speakers and writers like Frederick Douglass, who used his own story to show the world just how cruel slavery really was. And eventually, something had to give. The tension just snapped. The southern states decided to leave the Union, to form their own country, all to protect the institution of slavery. This kicked off the Civil War. It was unbelievably brutal, still the deadliest war in American history. In the end, though, President Abraham Lincoln and the Union won. The nation was held together, and slavery was, at long last, abolished. So, the Civil War is over. The country is stitched back together, even if by force. And this marks a huge turning point. America starts to transform itself at an insane pace, becoming this industrial powerhouse, and for the first time, a real player on the global stage. And what's driving all this change? The Industrial Revolution. I mean, think about it. Suddenly you have electricity thanks to people like Edison, and the telephone from Alexander Graham Bell. These things completely changed everyday life. Railroads were crisscrossing the country, connecting everything. And this created a massive pull. Millions of people left their farms, and millions more came from all over the world, flooding into these new, booming cities, all of them hoping to get a piece of the American dream. The more powerful America got at home, the more it started looking outward. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was kind of its first big step. Then came World War I, which really showed off its new military muscle. Of course, it wasn't all a straight line up. The Great Depression in the 30s was a total economic disaster. But the real game changer was World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, America jumped in, and by the time it was over, there was no doubt. The U.S. was a global superpower. So after World War II, the world basically split down the middle. On one side, you had the United States and its allies pushing for democracy and capitalism. On the other, you had the Soviet Union and its allies pushing for communism. This kicked off a 40-year standoff we call the Cold War. They never really fought each other directly, but they competed in everything else, from backing opposite sides in other conflicts to a massive arms race, and of course, the space race, to see who could get to the moon first. And that brings us into the more modern part of the story. You know, for a while, the biggest fights were happening overseas. But now, the most important battles were being fought right at home. It was a struggle to make the country finally live up to all those amazing promises it made way back in 1776. It's pretty staggering when you think about it. 100 years after the Civil War, African Americans were still being denied basic human rights. That's what sparked the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. You had incredible leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who championed nonviolent protest to take on segregation and injustice. Things like the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, these were monumental moments that led to huge legal victories and truly changed the face of America. So why is the U.S. so influential today? Well, you can really boil it down to three main things. First, its economy. It's still the biggest in the world, and a leader in tech. Second, its military. It's the most advanced on the planet, with allies everywhere. And third, it's culture. I mean, think about American movies, music, brands. You see and hear them all over the world. But look, the story is far from over, and it's never been a fairy tale. On the one hand, America's greatest strengths are probably its diversity, people from everywhere, and that powerful idea of the American dream, the belief that anyone can make it. But on the other hand, it's still wrestling with some really tough long-term problems. Things like the ongoing fight for racial justice, a huge gap between rich and poor, and a political system that feels more divided than ever. So, when you look back, you see the story of the USA is anything but simple, right? It's this constant tug of war between incredible ideals and some very harsh realities. It's a story of amazing progress, but also really deep struggles. If there's one theme that runs through it all, it's this idea of resilience and constant change. Which, I think, leaves us with the only question that matters now. What's the next chapter going to look like?